all of the issues around the, telecoms tariff hike have now raised concerns about many issues about Nigeria, including concerns that border squarely on the consumer protection. I mean, the question of who protects the consumers. To what extent are they protected? Do they even know their rights as consumers in the first instance? In a country, for example, where every other day we need to ask questions about those essential services that we patronize, and of course products as well. Where, for example, the rights of consumer or a consumer are infringed upon, how do they even know that there's been an infringement? And in any case, how do they seek redress? What is the process for lodging complaints with the service provider, whether it's telecoms, pay TV, or even the power distribution sector? So these are basically issues that the everyday Nigerian is concerned about. Now that we are at this particular point in time discussing a telecoms tariff hike, it has become more important again to say, who exactly does the regulator, the NCC in this case, protect more, if at all? Is it the telecoms operators themselves or the consumers who patronize these services, whether it's data or calls? Very important questions we must ask, no doubt about that. This morning we're joined by a development lawyer and a socio-economic analyst talking about Eze Oyekbere. Thank you, first off, Mr. Oyekbere, for making our time this Wednesday morning to join us on the program.
My pleasure being here. Thank you. Did you hear me?
Okay, so it's a pleasure to have you on the program. But let's begin with first things first, the issue of protection of the consumers. Today in Nigeria, for example, Nigerians use products, patronize services. However, when there are issues around their rights, especially when these rights have been infringed upon, who exactly should they look up to protect them, ideally?
Well, let me start by saying that we have a Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Council and the law of 2018, which repealed the old law. And sectorally, we have regulators, like in electricity, we have the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. And under the new dispensation, electricity regulation is being decentralized. States are now establishing their own commissions. In the telecom sector, you have the NCC, the Communications Commission. And of course, in banking, you have the Central Bank. And in as many sectors as possible, there are oversight and regulatory agencies who set the rules and enforce the law in that sector. And then, of course, the overall Consumer Protection Agency. But the important thing to note is that you must be aware of your rights, what the rules say, so that when they are violated, you can now make a claim. If you are not aware in the first instance, it will be extremely difficult for you to make a claim because you wouldn't even know when your right has been violated. You will only be thinking of what services that are rendered to you as if to say they are doing you some favor. But these are matters of rights and duties. Once you fulfill your own part of the bargain, they should be entitled to do theirs as well, to render the service to you. So that is my starting point.
All right, it's a brilliant place to start from, Mr. Oyekbere. But let's look at the Nigerian case. Typically, there are those who say that most of these regulatory agencies are more like there for the records. It's not as if they are really as effective as one would have thought. Some have said if anyone has ever been really effective in bias for Nigerians, it was NAFDAC, particularly under the leadership of late Professor Dora Akunyili, blessed memory. But let's look at how effective or otherwise our regulatory agencies have been. We've talked about the telecom sector, for example, the NCC. You've talked about, in passing, the NERC, that's the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Overall, you also mentioned in passing the FCCPC, the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, which used to be a council, by the way. With all of these preponderance, this potpourri, as it were, of regulatory agencies, What are we missing as a nation?
Now let me get back to where I started. The consumer has to be aware of what constitutes his rights and his duties under the various sectors you've mentioned. And if your rights are breached when you have performed your duties, the law talks about ibi jus ibi remedium. Where you have a right, there must be a remedy once it is violated. For instance, I have tried to activate the remedial measures under the Electricity Act. A personal case, I can tell you, but other people who suffered the same fate with me may not have known what to do to activate it. Where I live, I had established a trajectory of my average consumption. I mean, I buy credits loaded to my meter every month. So I had a challenge with the meter. It was removed. Pending when I got a new one, they were putting me on estimated billing. But in 1 month, somebody in the district multiplied my usual tariff, which there's a history, by 3, and gave me a bill. I said, no, this can't be my bill. I went to complain. He said it was meter reading. I grudgingly paid because I didn't want to be disconnected. The next month, they times that times 3 by another times 2. Did it the 3rd month, I refused to pay. After the 2nd month, I now went to NEC, to the forum in Guarimpa. I filed an application. They were served and they came. And after the forum looked at all the facts, went through the technical details, they discovered that I have been overbilled and surcharged an excess 250,000. They decided the case in December. So they were ordered, the disco office nearest to my home, they were ordered to pay me 250,000. They now said, well, they don't have the money to pay, that each time I want to buy credit, they will see a way of giving me, if I buy like 10,000, they will give me 20 or 30 until after a period of time when that money will be gone. But there were other people, the day we went there, people were wailing and crying, and they were being treated like criminals. I had no time. I sent one of my junior lawyers, and I said, don't go there to be apologetic. Tell them that they are thieves, they are violating the law. When I called who was their principal or manager there, he was talking rubbish. I told him that this is the last time you are going to steal. I called him names and dared him to sue me. And so today we've established that they are owing me 250,000. So that's an example.
All right, that example is quite inspiring. I mean, I wish every Nigerian watching now or who get to hear you share this story would take a leaf from it and also see how they can replicate it in their respective situations or experiences. But, well, we can't guarantee that just yet. Let's go specifically to the telecom sector now. Of course, I'm not sure, I mean, we don't have to go into all of the details again because apparently I'm sure that you've been following the narrative the entire time. There's the argument of whether or not the NCC in particular is more in favor of the telecom service providers or actually working to practically protect the rights of the Nigerian who uses telecom services in this country. But by way of being fair to the NCC, there are those who also argue and say, hold on a second, I mean, there has to be some sort of equilibrium because on the one hand, the NCC knows it has, as part of its mandate, a responsibility and obligation to protect the consumer. However, the businesses that provide these services must also stay afloat. Mr. Yekpere, how do we strike a balance from a regulatory standpoint?
Good. The NCC has to ensure fair prices and fair returns for investors so that they can continue investing and improving services. That's one of their duties. They also have a duty to protect the consumer. So striking a balance will mean, yes, a cost-reflective tariff, as they always say in the electricity industry, but that cost must also be anchored on the standards of living and the cost of living and the income of people who are to pay. Because whenever it's time for tariffs, whether it's electricity or anything, they say cost-reflective. And that cost reflective is not looking at the economics of your pocket, how much you earn. But when it comes to the negotiation of minimum wage, nobody talks about a minimum wage that takes you home to reflect the standard of living that you should live as a citizen of Nigeria they now tell you this is what we have. So there must be some meeting points between the minimum wage, what people earn both in public and private sector, and the tariffs you are imposing, whether it's on electricity, water, telecoms, in that economy. Otherwise, there will be a disconnect. So I have no problem if the telecoms people say they've not increased tariffs in the last couple of years. I have no problem for them to recover their costs and don't go under, so that we don't get back to square one. But it must be such that an average Nigerian must be able to afford it and be able to take care of his family. So that's where I see the balance striking. But I will also go back to the electricity sector to talk about this cost-reflective tariff. Just pardon me for a moment,
right,
so that you understand what the issues are. I have always asked them in the electricity sector that we should deconstruct the concept of costs. Now let's look at what happens. There is the generation companies. They generate and put it into the grid, which is run by the transmission company. The transmission company carries it into the city, where it's stepped down by a disco and distributed. Now, available information from NEC indicates that the disco, for every 100 megawatts that is put up by the generation company, which is metered, everybody saw they put in 100 megawatts. Between transmission and distribution, about 35% of that is lost. So what eventually gets to the customers will be 65 out of 100 that's already metered to have left the disco, of which they will demand to be paid, which is legitimate and legal, because everybody saw through the meters that they put in 100. What gets to the customer between transmission and distribution is about 65. Between 30, 35 to 40 sometimes is lost. So when you want to charge your costs that are cost-reflective tariff, who bears the brunt of the 35 that was mismanaged by the transmission company and the discos, their own inefficiencies? It is still put back on the neck of the customer. So when people are discussing costs, let us disaggregate the costs and know who should bear what. Because it is not my duty as a consumer of electricity to bear those costs. Those who have invested in the discos and transmission company have a duty to reduce those technical losses, commercial losses, to the minimum. The international standards is usually about 5 or 7. So when you do 35 and you want to compare yourself with another economy where people are losing only 5 to 7%, we are not being fair to ourselves, because those who have the discos have refused to invest in modern transformers, have refused to invest in modern equipment. Even the meter, which is the main thing they need to collect money from you, they have refused to invest. Nigerians are still paying for the meters. Sometimes the federal government will borrow money from the World Bank, or CBN will bring out money to give them, to send meters to people. So they have refused to invest, and then they want the customer to bear all the costs. So we must understand these things as a totality. So I am for a cost-reflective tariff. But if you are the one who is causing losses, I shouldn't be the one to pay. So whoever is responsible for the loss of that 35% of energy between generation and my home should pay, and not me, because you should pay. I should be metered and paid based on what I consume, and not on some technical losses incurred by transmission and distribution companies.
I think at this point we should look at this whole issue from the standpoint of legislation. There are Nigerians who have argued, I mean brilliantly so in many cases, that legislators, particularly at the federal level, do not hold regulatory agencies and their leadership accountable enough, and they are quick to cite anti-competition agencies in Europe and America, for example, protection agencies beyond the shores of Nigeria. They're quick to cite all of that. And another instance they cite to drive home their point is to say, look at pay television, for example. It's supposed to be, as it is in many countries, pay as you watch, or pay per view, as the case may be. But in the case of Nigeria, it is radically different. It is the opposite. You pay for a 30-day service, and if you happen to travel 2 days into that subscription and you come back after 3 weeks or after a month, it would have expired. I mean, that's validity would have cycled out and all of that. And they're saying that from their standpoint, what they see is Our legislators, whether they are senators or House of Representative members, must find a way to hold regulatory agencies accountable so that in turn they would also hold the executives of these service, these operators to account.
I perfectly agree with you. First of all, let's even discuss the regulators. If you recall, at the beginning of telecommunications revolution in Nigeria, MTN, Airtel said it was not possible to build by the second. And when Glo came on, it was their unique selling point to say we can bill per second. And immediately they started billing per second, and it appeared they were using it to take away customers from the others. These people, under a space of a month or two, started billing per second. So which meant the technology and the capacity to bill per second was there, but they did not consider it to be in their interest. They will get more money if they continue billing you per minute. And so, even Glo, the third company that came, could not have done that if it was part of those who shared the market. They were coming in at a time they felt the other two big companies are taking a very huge chunk. So the only way they could start getting some customers off them was to innovate. So in essence, it is the duty of the regulatory agency to say, wow, you cannot make this thing 1 month. For instance, I have an instance, this DSTV and those companies, cable television. I don't live in the East. I have a home there. I will travel for Christmas and I want to watch DSTV. I will pay, stay 5 or 7 days, and I pay for the whole month, and I leave. And even when I leave, the next month they will start calling me to come and renew. No, I tell them that, look, I've left that place, I'm no longer there. But they want me to keep renewing this thing so that they will, when I don't watch. So it is the business of the regulator. I also agree with you that if the regulator is not regulating well, then the oversight powers of the National Assembly should be invoked to call the regulators to order, to tell them this is your duty, you must do it well, and if you don't do it, we may censure you or recommend to the president that those who are in charge of those agencies be removed. So I perfectly agree. It is a failure of regulation as well as the failure of oversight on the part of the legislature.
And then there's the banking sector as well, Mr. Yepe. Several instances, maybe time will also fail us to go into all of those rigorous details. But let's look at one that is very prominent right now, and it's ubiquitous, as they will say. The idea that, you go to the bank, for example, you go to your bank ATM terminal to withdraw cash of whatever amount, and it's not dispensing because there's no cash, or if it's dispensing, it limits it to a certain amount, sometimes as small as 5,000 or 10,000, especially for those within residential areas, like within estates and all of that. However, you go to the ATM, the POS terminal by the corner, the guy or the lady there is able to give you as much as 100,000, 200,000, sometimes $500,000, because they have all the money. Now the question has been that, how is it possible? Who is going to explain to us how that your bank's ATM terminal is not dispensing money at all, or in some cases, if it does at all, it's limited to maybe 10, 20,000. That's where it caps at. But then the POS operator has sometimes as much as $1 million to give to you if you want that much. Now, many persons in the country will argue that that is within the purview of the CBN. We have seen the CBN, dole out several circulars about this. We have seen the CBN say that we have warned banks, we have sanctioned banks, we have called the executives of these banks, and so on and so forth. When we look at all of this, do you think, you are a lawyer who comes with several years of experience, do you think it's time Nigerians started adopting the class action method?
That's also where I think Nigerians have not put their rights to test. What is happening between the CBN and the banks is an incestuous relationship, because it appears that for some time many of the CBN governors have come from the banks. So the kind of relationship they have is not proper. It's not the relationship of a regulator and a regulatee. So banks are getting away with what I call murder, in the sense that your money shouldn't be subject to anybody regulating when you want to come to take it. Even if you are going for the cashless economy, in a cashless economy, there must be incentive for people to start using their phones to transfer, to start using other means apart from coming to the banking hall to carry cash. But a situation where ordinary app on your phone, or even the one you have on your laptop to transfer money, sometimes it will be scrolling for an hour and you produce no result. Sometimes you walk into a banking hall, they tell you their system is hung up. So the need is that the CBN should give these people a deadline so that they can improve on those their backup IT and telecommunication equipment. A very big bank in Nigeria for almost 1 week almost shut down its doors because they could not. They said they were transiting from one IT stuff to another. So it's because the central bank has failed in its duty of regulation. And that is why they're able to do that. Otherwise, if the central bank gives them a mandate, gives them a timeline that they're saying recapitalize, move on to this new platform, make sure it's functional, and if you have this percentage of failure, acceptable percentage of failure in your IT downtime could possibly be 5 or 10%. Once it exceeds that, there should be a penalty. But the CBN is not interested. So that's why I call it an incestuous relationship. It's an unfortunate relationship.
Let's take it back to a part of where we started from, Mr. Yekpere, the issue of the telecoms tariff hike. As of today, we understand that yesterday, Tuesday, for example, the Nigeria Labour Congress had to shelve its proposed strike, which was supposed to also co-opt consumers, the consuming public, as part of, not strike, I should say, peaceful demonstration that had been proposed. Now, they've shelved all of that because we understand the NLC has reached some understanding with the federal government to say, look, let's set up a committee to look at the immediate and, extant factors that even led to the calls for upward review of telecoms tariff hike in the first instance. Now, some people say, we are postponing the evil day because the telecoms operators themselves are going to stop at nothing until they've been able to box the regulator, that's the NCC, into a corner wherein it will have no other option than to ensure that this 50% upward review comes to stay. What are your thoughts along those lines?
Well, if everybody in several sectors have been granted an upward review, I think those in the telecom sector may have a case for a review, but whether it is going to be as much as 65% they are proposing is something I cannot explain until I see the technical details and the basis for calculation. Well, if you want to kill an issue, you refer it to a committee or a panel. There's a joke, we call somebody panel man. So this new panel set up by the federal government is one of those ways of taking something away from public glare, and sooner than later, we forget it. They may be entitled to an increase, but I don't know whether they need 65% increase. I suppose that's what that panel should look at, the technical details of how they calculate their costs and what they should charge and what profit they make. Yes, they're entitled to return on the investment, but it shouldn't be excessive so as to cut out people who are already poor from being able to access telecom services. So I think that's what the panel should be doing. So if you are giving electricity the opportunity to increase, telecom should also have the right to say, we are shopping in the same market. Most of our services or goods or intermediate products we use are imported. The Naira has taken a battering, dollar is very high. So these are the traditional agreements that will come up. But what I'm saying, it may not be as much as they propose. We should look at it critically and see what percentage they should be offered.
All right. I would like to say a big thank you to you at this point. Is a development lawyer and socio-economic analyst for sharing your valuable insight with us on Global Morning today.
Thank you, ma'am.
This is where we take a quick break on the program. Everyone, coming up next will be the trade war that has been started by the U.S. under President Donald Trump. What are the implications for the rest of the world, including for our dear country, Nigeria? All of that and more after this break. Please stay with us.